So we are at 12:30, so we will get this ball rolling. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. We're really excited to be able to bring this new edition of our webinar to our membership. And it's a really great opportunity for us as a WRLA to introduce one of our newest team members, who is Amber McGuckin, and will be speaking today. She has a background in journalism, and we're very fortunate to have her as part of our team, as she has had the opportunity to work in a lot of the regions in which our members are represented, and has had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the industry as well. And we're so pleased to have her, and I really do hope that you will rely on her as a resource as we continue to move forward. We are going to be recording this session, so you're welcome to share this with your team. Once the recording is completed, we will send that out. We do have a Q&A function, so if you have some questions that we can address at the end, we will be delighted to do so. And obviously, if there's an opportunity for us to maybe have some conversation at the end, we can certainly open up the mics as well so that we can have some conversation. As you're all well aware, we're in a really unique time in this industry and in a time frame where supply chain issues have never been so robust and challenged. And obviously we're trying to mitigate through all of these together, and the media has certainly been covering lumber like never before, and we're experiencing issues like never before. So we really wanted to be here to support you, understanding that the media is looking to speak with you and help also prepare our membership for some of those conversations. And having been a part of them, we're also here to be a resource. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Amber to kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Liz. So I've put together a little bit of a media management presentation. And so we're going to kind of go over some of the basic things to kind of know about if you're going to be in the media spotlight. Just to reiterate a little bit of what Liz was saying, there are some ways you can ask questions. So everyone who's an attendee is going to be muted, but you should be able to hear me. And if you want to ask questions, there's the chat or Q&A icon. It's at the bottom of your screen. I did get a little picture here that Jess put together. If you have a question, just pop it in there and we'll get it. We're going to be monitoring that channel. So if you do have questions, you can put them in at any time. And like Liz says, we are recording the session, and a copy of the presentation will be made available on our website after. So first, I want to give you a little bit of background about me. I was a journalist for full-time about 7 years. I worked in print, radio, TV. I worked in Northwestern Ontario, Saskatchewan, and mostly in Winnipeg, where in Winnipeg I worked at Global News. So some of my stories did go kind of cross country. So, with that experience, I've done countless interviews, worked with, countless small business owners, covering stories, a range of topics. So I've had, the privilege of doing all of that in the beginning of my career. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to give you guys some of the tips and tricks from what I know from being on the other side of things. And as you guys know, you probably can't pick up a newspaper or tune into a newscast without seeing something about lumber these days. It's been across every platform and across everywhere in the country. So I kind of took some snapshots of some of the recent articles, but just to kind of, obviously you guys are seeing all of that. And I think, I wanted to give some context as to kind of why I think this is probably such a big story and addressed kind of every single day. I get a new Google alert, there's a story about lumber. And I think, as you guys know, the pandemic has been the top story since 2020. And journalists are now looking for kind of the other ways that the pandemic is impacting things. So lumber is a really good topic and a really good, explanation for what things are, the trickle-down effect of the pandemic. So I think that's part of why there's been extra attention on it. Of course, the prices are a hook, but I think, seeing the trickle-down effect related to the housing market and all of that, everything kind of connects, and it all kind of connects to COVID. So I think that's a really big hook right now for journalists. So before we get started into this slide, Jess, if you want to put up a quick poll for everybody. So I wanted to get a sense of everybody's experiences. Have you had a journalist call you for an interview this year? Are you anticipating it? But I think the big question is, has this happened so far? Give us a couple minutes just to see what happens. Okay, so we've got about 29% say yes, they have had a journalist call, and 71 have not. So, a lot of us have probably, this might be even the first time getting those calls from journalists. It's not, lumber wasn't something that was very topical, I would say, necessarily, but now I think with the COVID and the trickle down, it's been a big part of the conversation. Okay. So I wanted to give you guys some tips when a journalist calls. So journalists, if they're going to be calling you in the industry, they're usually going to be looking for your expert opinion. And I think that's what's really important to get across. You are an expert in your field just by nature of working in this field. So you've probably been paying attention to some press conferences, maybe now more than ever. You're hearing Trudeau's press conferences or your regional COVID updates. People seem to be tuning into those quite a bit. And maybe that wasn't something you're used to. The way you're hearing journalists in those types of environments is not going to be the same way that you're probably going to be interviewed. I think it's something that a lot of people, when they hear media, they think that they're going to be grilled to an extreme degree. But I think what's really important to know is what they're looking for when they talk to you is probably just the explanation and the expert opinion about all of this. So it's kind of a scary thing to hear a journalist be grilling a politician and you hear like these tough questions. But, there's a different standard of holding power to account that they're going to have for a politician who maybe is avoiding their questions for a couple weeks and somebody like yourself. Usually they're going to be just looking to kind of get that background. Journalists don't have all the answers. So what they're looking for from you is to get that explanation. It's also a great opportunity to get your business name out there. And that does have some value, some advertising value. If you are looked at as the expert, you can position yourself as an expert in your field. I think I guess a good example of this is I did a story about mortgages, and when I worked at Global and I spoke to a mortgage broker, and he said he messaged me like a month later and said like still a month later he was getting people who had watched my story and he was like getting all these referrals. So just kind of having that kind of credibility as being the voice that the journalists turn to for kind of that credible information, I think can go a long way. Okay, oops, I think I went too far. Okay, so if you do get the call from a journalist and you want to prepare for that interview, there are a couple things that you can do. The 5 W's are really key. So when you think about what kind of questions you're going to be asked, if you really refer to that, like who, what, where, when, why, and sometimes how, you can pretty much get the answers to any question the journalist will ask you. It might not be worded exactly the same, but kind of the gist of what they're going to be trying to get at is answering those questions. So if you kind of start to kind of think about what kind of things they would ask you, you might feel more prepared just that you've now kind of thought through some of those answers. Another good thing is to write down some key messages that you have. So things that you really want to get across in this interview. Additionally, you're going to want to gather some notes. So, if you want to get the latest stats on lumber costs or any other statistics that you might want to refer to, it would be better to have that prepared in advance so that you don't come to the interview and feel a little bit unprepared. Another important thing is to avoid jargon. So, you might think that you're able to, have this high level conversation with them, but most journalists don't have that insider lingo. So you also have to remember you're talking to a journalist, but ultimately you're trying to talk to your community. So pretty much try to talk to somebody who has really no experience in your industry so that the message is really clear, so there's no confusion over what you're trying to say. I think it's also good to remember that you're not trying to memorize a speech. I have done countless interviews where it was so clear someone was really nervous for that interview and had just kind of remembered a few like key messages and just memorized them. And when they didn't know how to answer a question, they just kind of said the same thing over again. But it is not a quiz. It's not a speech that you're having to do. So it's best to kind of just have that relaxed presence and really listen to what they're asking you. And additionally, practice. So it might seem silly to do a little practice interview, but if you have one coming up and you've got another person in your office or someone in your family, if you're working from home, who can kind of ask you some questions, you can kind of get a feel for what will happen in an interview. I have another poll, Jess, if you want to put that one up. So I was kind of curious, how would you react if a journalist called you? Would you be excited, nervous, apprehensive? Okay, this is cool. We're seeing some excited, some nervous, apprehensive. Great. Okay, so it seems that apprehensive came out on top, 60%, excited, 27%, and nervous, 20%. Yeah, I think a lot of people get a little bit, apprehensive. They're not sure what to expect, but I hope that after this presentation, you'll have a little bit more confidence going into that. Okay, so when you're in an interview, the only time I would say is to pivot if you have to. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this term in public relations, but it's kind of called spin. You've probably seen politicians do it. They are the experts at spin, which is pretty much how you would take say you're getting asked a question that you really don't want to answer, that you would kind of rephrase it and tell them something that they didn't even ask you. So politicians would be the best example of this. The only time I would recommend doing this is if you're in a live interview. So say you're in a live radio interview, for example, and you're asked about something that you really don't know the answer to. And it's good to kind of prepare your key messages. So say you're asked about something you really don't know, you can say like, hey, I'm not exactly sure about that, but I know this. And you can talk about something kind of related to that, but not the exact question you were asked. It's just a way to kind of smooth over the interview. So you're not kind of, especially in a live situation where it can be kind of awkward if you just say, I don't know, and then just end it like that. So it's good to kind of prepare how you would kind of move the conversation in a different direction. And now that you know this, you probably all have seen this with politicians, but now after this, you probably will spot them a little bit easier. Okay. So it's really important to always tell the truth. Honesty is truly the best policy. And if you don't know the answer to something, that is okay. You can take the time to review your notes or look it up. There's really nothing worse than being caught making something up. And if you don't know the answer or say you don't know the answer or you don't want to answer, you could try the whole spin thing where you just want to talk about something else. For the most part, you can remember your key messages so that you're not stumbling through something. But, especially if you're not in a live interview, it is totally okay to say, hey, I'm not sure about that one. Let me just refer to my notes. Or, you can just say, I'm actually not sure about that answer. And especially in a not live situation, you usually can have that sort of, it's not usually that high pressure where you're going to have to be answering every single question properly. Like I've done so many interviews where people were like, oh, hang on a second, I don't know if I got that right. I just want to refer to my notes. And most journalists will be very okay with that. That happens a lot. And people get so nervous that they have to have all the answers right in front of them. But people stumble through, and I've had to restart interviews because someone got so nervous. And if it's not live, there's usually a little bit more flexibility in that way. Okay, so kind of preparing for the interview, there's some things you really need to know. The moment you start talking to a reporter, whether that's them on the phone just calling you or emailing you, you really have to be on. There is really no such thing as off the record. If you have a really great relationship with a reporter, they might honor something that you say to them kind of privately, but as a rule, I would say don't tell a reporter anything that you're not okay being fully out there associated with your name and business. It's not to scare you. Most reporters are human, and you can hope that they would respect that, but there's truly no such thing as off the record. There's no sort of law to kind of prevent them from sharing this information. There's also, like, even if something's off the record, even sometimes within a newsroom, that information will be shared quite widely as to like who said something, just to kind of give context to the decision makers in the newsroom as to why something's maybe not public. But remember, you're being recorded as well. So so when I worked in TV, I would, people would be mic'd up. And even if the camera is not on you, your microphone might still be recording. And I have had some embarrassing moments where people have taken that to the bathroom, but I've also had some more serious moments where people are now in conversation with a colleague after they think the interview's wrapped up, and they're saying things that they for sure did not want us to hear. And so it's really important to remember that you're being recorded. That goes for anything. Like I said before, if you're going to email with a reporter, you can expect that information is fair game. If they call you on the phone and you're just kind of casually chit-chatting, fair game. Everything's really fair game the second that you are talking to them. You just have to be really careful about what you're saying. But it's still important to just be friendly and stick to your key messages. I have another poll, Jess. This is the last poll. So, have any of you prepared any key messages before? Okay. So lots of yeses here. That's great. Couple no's. Awesome. Well, 85% have said yes, and 15% have not. So we'll kind of go over that a little bit. So if you're preparing for a media interview, you kind of want to have maybe 1 to 3 key messages. So an example would be like, if you are stumped on how to answer a question, or you want to kind of add additional information when you're asked a question, you can say something like, these are unprecedented times as we're trying to get stock in as fast as possible, or everything along the supply chain is going up in price. Our customers are paying more, but so are we. Or COVID has left an impact on the supply chain with closures, rise in demand and a shortage of supply. So these are kind of key messages that you really want to get out there, like the why you're doing this interview, would be those kind of key messages. It's really important to have a few of them in mind so that you kind of walk into the interview with kind of something in your back pocket that you want to add. It's okay to repeat yourself, and it's probably best to kind of find a new way of saying it. Typically, like if you watch a news story, for example, or a radio story, they're going to use like a couple seconds of something that you said. So it's okay. Like they might only use one 15-second clip of a whole interview that you've done. And so it's okay to repeat yourself. But it's just kind of going back to the other things I was saying. You don't want to say the exact same thing over and over again. But if there's an avenue to kind of bring up one of your key messages again, that's totally okay. And that's probably a good way of doing it. Okay, so it's important to be responsive. People in the media are really busy. Of course, all of us are busy as well, but journalists are covering sometimes multiple stories each day with extremely demanding deadlines. And I can attest that journalists do not always have a high attention span. So if you get a call and you do want to be interviewed, it's really important that you don't wait. They're usually going to be contacting everyone. If say it's a story about lumber prices or small businesses, you're not going to be the only one that's receiving this request. And so it's really important to act fast, or that moment could pass you, because they really don't care if it's you or your competition or whoever. They're really just going to take the first possible one because they have some big deadlines to face. So, it's not something that you can be like, oh, I'll get back to them next week, because next week might be too late. So I wanted to talk a little bit about earned media. I'm not sure if you guys have heard this term, but it's pretty much the way of getting free advertising through media. So I guess the gist is, when you buy an ad, you're getting attention, but when you're in the article, it helps earn credibility. And that's a little bit of what I was referring to before with that mortgage broker story, where, he could have put an ad on the news, but now kind of being in the story, he, had this sort of credibility attached to him as to, he's the one that Global News went to. Out of all the mortgage brokers that we could have gone to, they went to him. So kind of gives them a little bit of recognition. And that's why, it's really important to kind of take these opportunities. Okay, so if you want to get media attention, I joked it's time to make some friends. There are some ways you can really connect with local journalists, so you can reach out to them directly. And I think it's really important to kind of expand who you think is a journalist. So, your local radio host, it could even be like your rock station or pop station, it could be anything. There could be a community newsletter. Sometimes some small places have, or really hyper local communities have great newsletters or really small papers. So reach out to the people that are, working in those roles directly. You can start a conversation with them about something they've written. Like, say you're genuinely a fan of this local reporter's work on something, feel free to message them. They get a lot of negative messages, so anything that's kind of positive really stands out for sure. And let them know that you would be interested in being interviewed. You can also pitch them something very specific. Say you've got like a milestone at work, like some anniversary, or you do something for the community. Feel free to pitch them. If you want, you can go onto our website under press room. You can see some examples of press releases that we've sent out. There's also, if you just Google it, you can kind of look up real templates for how to do this. It's not a big deal if you want to do something more formal. If you want to do something informal, a little email is really good. Like, reporters get pitched in all different kinds of ways, from a phone call to an informal email, an in-person moment. So you don't have to have all your ducks in a row and do something extremely formal if you just don't know how to do it, or you're not comfortable doing it. Of course, you can always reach out to me as well, but if you wanted to do something on your own, that's totally fine. There are also freelancers who do this. Sometimes they can be really great assets depending on your situation, but sometimes it's not actually that much work to just email the local people that might be interested in your story, and doing it that way. And so, if you wanted to pitch them, you have to kind of think like a journalist. So think about things that they would be interested in talking about and find a hook to the story. So if it's something like a milestone anniversary, maybe find some good hooks in that. Or if you're doing a, fundraiser, find the hook to whatever cause it is. Maybe work with that association. If you're working with a charity, maybe they can help you and you can work together. But kind of think like a journalist. What would somebody really want to cover in all of this, and find the hook in the story that you are wanting to present to them. And it's, I think, really helpful to pitch people directly. So if you have like a general newsroom inbox, it's probably going to get ignored at a higher degree than something that's pitched directly to journalists that you've maybe built a relationship with, or that you're trying to build a relationship with. So that's really important. If it's personalized, like you actually write their name in it, that's helpful. And a journalist who covers lifestyle may do a feature on like a community fundraiser that you've done, or say you've done like a big donation of some kind. You can kind of look for the journalists that typically cover stuff like that and pitch them directly. It does take a little bit of work, but you probably have more success pitching people who have already kind of covered similar things. And like a journalist covering business could cover the impacts of COVID on small businesses. So you can look in your local newspaper. There's sometimes like reporters have certain beats. So that can be a helpful place to go as well. It's really important to look the part. I got this great photo of Liz the other day, and it's kind of funny because we were touching on this a little bit before, but many interviews are conducted on Zoom these days, and it may mean that you're going to be recorded. So it's really important to kind of always, if you're going to be doing an interview, prepare like the way you look, that you're okay and comfortable with. That's how you're going to be presented. Even newspaper articles still often take a photo of you. Sometimes they do video as well. So it's really important to make sure that you are going to look the part. I've joked with Liz that she's gotten so many requests lately that she should have just a spare jacket or spare outfit at work just in case we get a last minute request, because you really just don't want to get caught with your lunch stain on your shirt or something like that, and you really want to do this opportunity. So it's also good to check the mirror for your teeth and your hair. I have had to awkwardly tell many people that they've got some spinach or something in their teeth before, and not everybody catches it. So it would be pretty embarrassing to get caught on TV with something in your teeth. So it's really important to look the part and to just remember that no matter what kind of interview, usually radio, you'd probably be safe, but if they're doing a radio interview in person, they might actually be taking a photograph of you, or maybe they are getting a video for their website. Video is a big component where they can make some money on advertising dollars. So there is a big push on video as well. So kind of regardless of the medium, just remember that there could be a visual component. If you're doing an interview, it's good to offer extra information. So like I said before, if you're preparing for the interview, maybe get some reports or statistics together. But if you're going to reference anything in your interview, it's good to kind of back that up and have that, in an email to the reporter after, because if you're going to just say some stat off the top of your head and not have any data to back that up, they can't really use that information, or they'll credit it to you, which maybe isn't accurate. So that is the end of my presentation. And so we're ready to take some questions from all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. I'm really glad that you covered off at the very beginning the whole piece about not being grilled like in politics. I can attest that I personally have had that same anxiety, thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to get caught saying? Is this going to turn into attack? And it's not at all like that. So I'm really glad that you did cover that off, because it truly isn't the intent. And usually the journalists are really excited to get some of those more details just to help them with the story, because it really does add context. And as you mentioned, you're often not the only person that's the subject of the interview. There might be others. And it's really important to have those stats, because sometimes some of those folks are using hearsay or personal opinions. And it's nice to have those stats, which will then combat what it is that they're saying. So we do have a few questions, and obviously we'll have some members putting some questions through as well. But one of the key things that I've noticed in some of the conversations I've had is people asking for forecasts. And how do you handle those tough questions when someone's really trying to get you in a different way, because they ask the question in different ways of how you can forecast where we're going to be, whether it's on lumber or other building materials in the future?
Yeah. I think a lot of journalists, they're wanting to give some information to the public about this. Like they want to know, when are things going to go down in lumber prices? What's going on? I think what's really important is we don't have a crystal ball. No one has a crystal ball unless you actually know unless you actually know the answer. Don't speculate. I think that's just a general good rule to have, is never ever to speculate in an interview, because you don't know, and you really don't want to get caught giving some information that turns out to not be true. And then people are kind of like, oh, well, you said that, by this day our, deck would cost this much. And now
Right.
you're kind of like, oh, awkward. I shouldn't have said that. And so I think it's really important to kind of steer the question. It's kind of like that pivot. So you kind of can steer the question to something that maybe you do know the answer to, like, okay, these are unprecedented times for lumber. So we've never seen anything like this. We weren't expecting this. And so So instead of saying, you can even honestly say, hey, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I do know is we've never seen prices this high. So you can be honest with them, but don't ever catch yourself speculating. And it's really important to just, if you do that, you can really catch yourself in a sticky situation.
Well, it goes back to just being on the record all the time. Everything you say is on the record. And,
Yeah.
I will say journalists have been very responsive. If we didn't have the answer, we would send follow-up information or even graphs, just some visuals to help them really give them a good visual. And it certainly helps with the story because it does provide all those additional elements rather than focusing on just one element. So one other question that we have is in what's the best ways that you can recommend in terms of gathering a media list? So if you wanted to be proactive and share some of those milestones that you might be having, or you may have read a story and you want to be able to provide some more information, how is it best to compile that media list?
Yeah, I have my own little media list that I've put together. And I think the best way of doing it is to kind of create a little email list for you on your mail, like on your email. And it would be good to kind of go through all of the regional media. So it depends on where you live, kind of depends on which outlets you have to pick from. But usually most, like if you grab your local newspaper, you can usually see the bylines, and sometimes they actually have their emails at the bottom of the article, and just kind of start collecting that information. And then when you do want to put out some information, I would recommend kind of emailing all those people directly. It depends on how big your list is. If you've got a really massive list, you can send to everybody at once. But say you're in a smaller place or you want to really target a few journalists, I would kind of target them directly. And I would look in every single outlet. So if you've got some local radio stations, I would check their contact page. You'd be surprised, but like most journalists, their information is somewhere. So if it's not on their website, it probably is. If it's not, it will be on Twitter or something like that. They're really like, journalists are wanting you to give them story ideas and give them tips. So you can really find someone's information quite quickly. Or if you're struggling, you can call the newsroom and usually get some good context that way.
Oh, great. Thank you. Hopefully that answered the question that came from Monica.
Awesome.
So just another question that we have is, how do you avoid coming off poorly in an interview, especially if you might be a little bit nervous? What are some tips?
Yeah, it's really important to try to remain calm or just kind of fake it till you make it. You might be really nervous underneath, but just, try to contain that composure because you want to come across confident in what you're saying. And if you're stumbling over your words and you're stressed out, that's not a great look. So you're going to want to try to remain calm, but you're also going to not want to look too rigid. I think what's really important is to remember not to say anything that you really wouldn't want broadcast. So, don't just kind of speculate. Don't just say something off the cuff. You're going to want to really just try to be thoughtful about what you're saying, but also kind of natural. I mean, you have to remember people are not going to be interviewing you about like rocket science. They're interviewing you about things that you actually know. And I think if you're getting stressed out, just remember, hey, they're coming to me for my expert opinion. I actually know this. And so I think it's good to remember your context in all of this and how you are the expert in this situation.
And the end of the day, it does sort of turn out to be a conversation because I do find that most of the people, at least that I've connected with, have really tried to make it feel like we're having a conversation. And yes, everything's being recorded, but it made it seem like it was a little bit less stressful just from that perspective. And you can calmly get your information across, or it gives you that time also to reset if you tend to talk super quickly as well. So, and then in terms of the media interviews, obviously the first one is always that first one that you need to get past. But what would you recommend in terms of getting better and practicing at it so that if you do get those calls that you feel cool as a cucumber to be able to handle it?
Yeah, I think if you have anyone in your office or if you're working from home, like a family member, you can kind of practice with. I know it seems so silly, but it really does make a difference when you practice doing it and practice being asked questions that you weren't, that you didn't get to
Yep.
see in advance. Because for the most part, journalists will not share their questions with you in advance, not really out of any other reason other than sometimes they don't even know what they're going to ask you till they're in the interview, like something pops up or whatever. So I think it's good to kind of just have that practice. You also will get kind of that practice just by remembering that, you probably speak to customers a lot or you speak in meetings a lot. And it really doesn't have to be that formal media interview, but sometimes like it's the same kind of conversation you're having with your customers that you're having with a journalist. So it's really, you have to kind of take it a step back, not be so, scared about it. And just remember, ultimately, you're not talking just to the journalist, you're talking to the community. And so kind of refer back to when you had meetings or been talking to customers. I think that's really important.
Awesome. Well, I was blessed with the gift of gab. So usually, just to refer back to your point, I find that sometimes the journalists will start asking questions based on what I've just verbally communicated to them, and then they can start picking up some things. So having that agenda prepared certainly does help. And usually some follow-up information does as well. So we don't have any more questions at this point to pose, but I did want to give the opportunity to members if anybody wanted to raise their hand, maybe even just to talk about some of the current issues that we're facing, and even just getting an idea of maybe some of the questions that you're being asked. We've really tried to put things into perspective. This is a temporary situation, and yes, there's a lot of high emotions, but the supply chain issues we're experiencing are really resulting of the pandemic, and we wouldn't be having any of these discussions if it wasn't for COVID. But if you are having some discussions or getting questions that you would like to share with us or the rest of the group, we certainly can provide a little bit of opportunity right now. And if there isn't any interest in doing so, then we can probably call it, but I'll just check to see if anyone does want to contribute.
Yeah. And while we're waiting, if anyone is ever getting asked about doing a media interview and you're stressed out and you forget everything we talked about today, feel free to give me a call or email me. My information is pretty easy to find on our website. So I'm accessible too. Or if you have questions about putting together a press release or pitching media, feel free to message me. Depending on where you are, I might have friends that are working in those newsrooms. So I've now worked with people who are across the country. I know people in almost like every city at this point. So people move around a lot in journalism. So yeah, if you have questions, like feel free to contact me.